Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this mighty KV-2. This is the 28mm scale plastic model from Warlord games. If you want to see the build video, there's a card in the upper right and a link in the description. I have of course also painted the KV-1 turret too, though we all know the KV-2 is more strong and glorious. I also painted a version with this very sensible bitey face on the side of the KV-2 turret as a commission, though this video doesn't really cover how I did that, but I thought it would be cool to show you anyway. The model was primed using Stynel Res Black Primer, which I think is quite nice, though there are of course plenty of other good choices for primer like Vallejo. I get started by airbrushing a base coat on all the hulls and turrets with Vallejo Model Air Russian Green. I build this up with a few light coats, slowly working my way up to a nice solid green in all the places that need to be green. Obviously the tracks are also mostly green too now, but that's not a huge deal and I don't think it's really worth masking them or anything like that. As long as everything that needs to be green is in fact green, it's fine. Next, I make some highlights. I make a mixture of roughly 4 parts Model Air Russian Green and 1 part Model Color Buff, and I spray this in a kind of zenithal highlight, which is to say that I'm spraying directly down onto the upper surfaces and very slightly to the sides. The idea is to represent the paint being slightly faded by the sun on the upper areas. I'm not really trying to represent actual sunlight, just faded paint. I then mix the same 2 colours again, Russian Green and Buff, but this time it's 2 parts green to 1 part buff. I airbrush this in a more focused way. I'm trying to hit the centres of the hatches, edges and raised surfaces in various places that would make sense to look a little bit more faded and worn, or that could maybe use a little bit of help to stand out, but not too much. I am trying to be kind of subtle with this. I don't really want stark highlighting. To continue using the same colours, I make a mix of 1 part Russian Green and 1 part Buff, and then dry brush it onto all the sharp edges and raised parts. I do this fairly roughly and I'm not especially worried about being neat with it. This can, and does, look a little bit scratchy owing to the brush I've used, which in this case is fine. Little scratches and imperfections in the paintwork make it look a little bit more used and realistic. You can see the difference this step makes quite clearly. I suppose if you really wanted to, you could just skip straight to this step without the airbrushed highlights, but I feel like they all work together to add a lot of nice variation to the base green colour of the tank, which I think makes it look more interesting. Next, to darken things down just a little bit, I apply a wash of Army Painter Strong Tone, thinned roughly 2 parts water to 1 part Strong Tone. I apply it all over the vehicle, not too heavily though. This is just to darken the colour down a little, add a bit of definition to the gaps and cracks, add even more colour variation and just a little bit of dirtiness to the tank. Then it's time for decals. I apply some gloss varnish where I intend to place the decals. In my case I'm using the Minotaur gloss varnish, but you can use whichever gloss varnish you like. This is to protect the acrylic paint and washes from the decal solvent, which in my case is Humbrol Decal Fix. No matter what you use to apply the decals though, a layer of gloss varnish will make them easier to apply and manipulate and prevent silvering. I'm just going to use a simple red star decal on my turrets, though there are a few options on the sheets. Unfortunately there were only 2 red stars, and I'm painting both the KV-1 and KV-2 turrets, so I've used some Battlefront red stars instead, which despite being intended for 15mm scale, are almost the same size as the stars included with this kit. It's good to have a stash of decals. One of the turrets didn't receive any decals. Instead, I painted this happy little face onto the side. It's still a little bit messy here, but I was pretty pleased with it. Unfortunately, I lost most of the video of me actually painting it. Everything looks a little bit too neat and tidy at the moment, so I fixed that by adding some chipping with a mix of roughly 3 parts Model Color Black Grey to 1 part Model Color Mahogany Brown. The mix is very rough, and for this I kind of like to eyeball it, rather than following a strict formula. I apply it with a piece of sponge from a model package. I did a quick tips video about this technique, so if you want to know more, check the card in the upper right or the link in the description below. I tried to go quite lightly with the chipping on this. I want this to be a used but still fairly new and not yet beaten up KV. I think for the most part I was successful in not going too far with it. There are some patches that are quite heavy, but it doesn't look as though most of the paint has been chipped away, which is nice. Even the teethy face has a little bit of chipping just to make it fit with the rest of the model. I take the same paint mixture and use a fine brush to add a few straight, narrow scratches in various places. Not too many, but enough to add just a little bit of variety and interest to the chipping. Definitely go very lightly with this. You want it to look like scratches, not brush strokes. I then use Vallejo Model Color Mahogany Brown and paint the exhausts. I think this is a nice base for some rust effects later on. Now it's time to paint the tracks. I like to paint tracks grey, usually with model colour black grey, which is what I've used here. Nothing especially tricky about this. I use a larger, flat brush to make it easier to get into the tracks without accidentally painting the fronts of the wheels, drive sprockets, or the mudguard parts of the hull, if that's what you would call them. It's pretty easy to quickly get a nice good coverage with this large brush. I also painted the surfaces of the idler and road wheels that would run along the tracks. I used the black grey here too, though it might have looked better if I'd used the same colour I used for chipping. Metallics could be used here too, because this area has potential to be worn to a shine. I just don't really like using metallics on my tanks, at least on the tracks anyway. Usually it just doesn't quite look right in my opinion. At any rate, later steps will make the road wheels and tracks look different enough anyway. I then paint all the machine gun barrels black. I use the same black Stynylrez primer that I primed this tank with. I do this because the primer has better coverage than the Model Air black that I have. Obviously I do this carefully, so I don't inadvertently add random patches of black to the green parts. That would be annoying. At some point, the machine gun on the back of my KV-2 turret was broken off, and I couldn't find the missing barrel. So what I did was paint the area where the barrel would be with the black. My thought was to make it look as though the gun has simply been taken out of its mount. I then use model colour black grey to highlight the machine guns with a dry brushing along the tops of the barrels. I then take model colour London grey and give the tracks a dry brushing. I do this fairly roughly, I'm not really worried about it being too neat, and I mostly focus this on the tops of the tread detail and along the outer edges of the tracks. I also add this to the guide teeth in the centre of the tracks. This doesn't quite look right at the moment, but it should provide a good base for colour variation when all the weathering is added, and why not do some of that weathering now? I apply some Army Painter Dark Tone, mixed roughly 50-50 with water. I apply this only to the tracks themselves, and I'm avoiding the road wheels, drive sprockets and return rollers. This is just to darken the tracks a little bit and add some more shadow to them. I also added some of this to the exhaust pipes, but I forgot to film it. I then applied gloss varnish to the entire model, still Minotaur gloss varnish, and you can still use whichever gloss varnish you like. The gloss will protect the acrylic paint from the following enamels. I then apply AK Interactive Track Wash to, you guessed it, the tracks, and only the tracks. This is fairly simple. I don't try to get a completely solid coat of this. I want the greys underneath to kind of show through a little bit, otherwise the effort painting them would be lost and we wouldn't have much colour variation. Then it's time for a wash, of sorts. I apply AK Interactive Dark Brown Enamel Wash for green vehicles into the gaps and around details like hatches and grab handles, and inside vision slots and holes, even on the vent hole things on the engine deck. I'm really not worried about being neat with this at all. In fact, I'm being quite messy. That's okay, the next step is to clean it up. After leaving the wash to sit for a bit, I use a clean brush with fresh, clean white spirits and use it to thin out and wipe away the wash that's found its way into places I don't want it. The white spirit will reactivate the dark brown wash even if it's dried a little bit, so there isn't a rush to do this right away, but I like to do it fairly quickly. I try to do any brushing here in a downwards motion. Grime and dirt on the tank is most likely to be streaking downwards because of gravity. Gravity pulls things down. What a revelation. I then apply more gloss varnish. This is to lock the previous enamel layer in so that it won't be reactivated during the next step and cause a mess. I apply some AK Interactive Dark Streaking Grime. I mostly paint this on in lines down the sides of the tank to create streaks, strangely enough. These are quite messy. In this case, I didn't feel like these needed to be super neat, though if you want them to remain mostly visible then you should try to be a bit neater than I've been. I'm mostly going to be removing this stuff, I just want to use it as a very subtle effect. There weren't quite as many surfaces I felt would be effective to apply streaks to on the hulls, but I still added some, mostly on the rear and front surfaces. Then, like with the previous weathering enamel, I take a clean brush with clean white spirit, and with mostly downward strokes I remove most of the dark streak and grime. There's just enough there to hint at streaks of grime, nice and subtle. If you're unhappy with how much of the streaking grime you've removed, you can always reapply and re-remove, and so on. Which is actually one of my favourite things about working with enamels. As long as you've got that layer of gloss varnish, you can remove the enamel without removing the previous layers. Next, I rust up the exhaust pipes a little bit. First, I use AK Interactive Light Rust Wash. I thinned this a little bit and didn't try to apply a solid coat. Rather, I want it to be a bit patchy so it'll have a kind of patchy, rusty look to it. I wasn't entirely happy with this, so then I added AK Interactive Rust Streaks, in a non-streaky way. This is thinned too, but I apply it a bit heavier than the previous rust colour. This isn't too bad, but it will mostly be hidden by soot later anyway. At this point, I decided that I should paint the headlights rather than just leaving them green. I wasn't entirely confident that this would look good, but I figured why not give it a try. I base coated the lamp with Vallejo Model Air metallic gunmetal, or as the bottle says, gun. Simple enough, I just brush it on. While I let the metallic colour dry, I very lightly airbrushed some black primer around the exhaust pipes to represent soot. I didn't film this because I'm a numpty. Returning to the headlamp, I then add a highlight using Model Air steel. I apply this in an arc along the top and bottom of the light. I also add a small dot in the centre. This is an attempt to make it look as though it has some depth to it. It's a little messy, but it's not super awful. I then apply a little bit of very thin Army Painter blue tone ink to the bottom of the lamp lens. This was a mix of something like 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part blue tone. Very thin. I then mix the blue tone 50-50 with water and apply a bit more of this wash in a roughly triangular shape at the bottom of the lamp, with the tip of the triangle being in the centre. It's not well defined and you can't see it very well, but it's there. Again, my being a numpty means I didn't film myself painting the rim around the headlamp, but I did that using Vallejo Russian Green. It was obviously a quite small fiddly part to paint, so I went very slowly and carefully. This is such a small area of green that I didn't really feel much of a need to add any chipping or additional weathering to it. You can see what a difference painting the rim makes. I feel it looks that little bit better and neater. I then use a 2B pencil to add a little bit of metallic sheen to the raised portions of the treads where they'd be rubbing to a shine, if the tank was driving down a hard road or something like that. I also add this to the road wheels and the teeth of the drive sprocket. This might be covered by weathering later, and I might reapply some later, but I think it's a good idea to have it under the dust layers. Speaking of, I then apply AK Interactive Dark Mud. This is thinned, though I'm not exactly sure of the ratio. Something close to 4 parts thinner to 1 part dark mud. I apply this all over the model, though I mostly focus it on the lower areas of the hull, particularly the tracks. It's not super heavy, but it is visible enough. I follow this with AK Interactive Summer Curse Earth, thinned about the same ratio as the dark mud. I apply this much lighter, and I focused it mostly on the upper areas of the model. This is quite subtle and I'm pretty happy with it. I don't want these tanks to be filthy, but I don't want them to be spotless either. I then apply AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish to make everything nice and flat, and then, just as a finishing touch, I use the 2B pencil again on the tread details and the road wheels, and that's it. Warlord's KV-2, or if you want to be less derpy, KV-1 kit, is now fully painted and ready to crush the fascists beneath its mighty treads. I'm pretty happy with the results I've got. It's simple but effective. I wanted this to look like a reasonably well used but not totally beaten up tank, and I think I've achieved that. It's a bit dirty, but it's not filthy, and it's definitely not completely scratched up or rusted. It's really easy to go overboard with chipping and weathering. I think I managed to control myself well in that regard this time. I did quite enjoy the process of painting this pair of KVs, especially the bitey face that I was commissioned to do. Do those things have a name? I don't know. Either way, I think it's pretty entertaining and I'm happy with how it turned out. It did, unfortunately, take way longer to get this done than I was intending, but it's done now and I guess that's what counts. And this is the first painting video in what I've been calling the year of painting. The goal is to do a minimum of 1 painting video per month during 2018, and presumably beyond. So if painting is your thing, stick around for more. I am of course all for people experimenting and coming up with their own colours and paint schemes, and I would encourage that strongly, rather than simply copying what I've done. But if you're interested, there's a list of all the colours I used in the description below. And I do hope that some of the techniques and methods I've used in this video are helpful to you. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments section below. And of course, if you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe to me here on YouTube, follow me on social media, and watch me live stream on Twitch. And if you really like the things I do and want to support the year of painting, please consider heading over to patreon.com/herberterp and becoming a patron. Links to all of those things are in the description below. I shall return soon, so until then, happy modelling and thanks for watching. Farewell.